For those of you who were here last week, you know we postponed it until this week, and a deeply chagrined person has made a decision right after that I will never again try to forecast the weather. I'm out of that business. Anything we have from now on is a rain or shine. So I'll turn this now over to our dynamite historian, Bob Wilder.
It looks like we've got fewer than half of the number that were here last week and turned away. I'd like to personally welcome these many folks from the Quaboag towns, now extinct, who came to our tour today from Greenfield, Greenwich, and Enfield, and Prescott. I think it's, and Dana. I thank them for coming. When we make our tour today, because one of the sites has a very old, ancient, restrictive road, traffic is going to be very, very difficult to deal with. See if you can double up and cut the number of cars that we're using. Even if you don't know your neighbor, see if you can ride with your neighbor. It's going to be terribly important logistically to try and cut down the size of this caravan. Last year, we had between 75 and 100 cars, and the last 20 cars, I understand, may not have made the last site. This is unfortunate, and we wouldn't want that to happen today. We have the Historical Society is having this entire tour put on film, so all of you are going to get your 15 minutes of notoriety when your face appears on television. America's Most Wanted's interested in us all, too. But we have reporters from Springfield and from Worcester, so our organization is pretty well represented in the media. I would encourage you to visit your local libraries. Will has made arrangements for tapes of our previous tours to be located in those libraries, and you may borrow them, so if you miss the tour, you won't miss that aspect of our history, and so you can actually have a little bit of a belated tour with us. This is going to be handled in the same fashion, so if you want to go home, go ahead and you can watch it next year on TV. We're not going to let you get away. On our tour today, what makes this so very special, and I agonized over this because one time someone said, you ought to put a bronze plaque on everything historical in the greater Brookfield, the 7 towns, and my attitude was we would have to bronze the entire communities because we have so many things, so many precious artifacts that still exist under our feet, and we don't know it, we don't notice it, we don't see it. Today, after we leave Site 1 and go to Site 2, you're going to pass through a hamlet. You're going to pass through a hamlet of buildings of early New England, and you probably passed that place a dozen times before and never realized that you had driven through virtually an entire community, a community that would have existed in the early 1700s. You're going to have a chance to see an early salt box, an early gambrel roof, the store, the blacksmith shop. We're going to see those all within a few hundred yards of each other. I'll explain that in a little more detail when we get to the first site. Just before we leave, I'll show you a little bit of a picture of what you can expect, where we're going to drive, what you're going to see. And then when we get to the second site, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. There are also some wonderful artifacts associated with the second site that I'm not going to show you today, but I'm going to show you what they are, so I'm really going to tease you with this. And the chairman of the Quaboag Historical Commission in Brookfield, the Brookfield Historical Commission, is going to give you a little more detail on how you can, if you're a little more adventuresome, get down and see these wonderful, wonderful early artifacts, which I'll describe in detail a little later on. The second site is probably the oldest standing man-made article of other than stone in the 7 towns that made up the original town of Brookfield. You have to understand we're talking about the frontier. We're talking about Brookfield as it stood in 1660 and how it was resurrected in 1686. We're going to a site that was built probably in 1698, and the house is still intact. Somewhat improved, but intact. It's gorgeous to see. We're very fortunate. We will not be able to enter the houses. You have to understand that. We have to respect the people's privacy. But please appreciate the fact that these people extended their courtesy to permit us to go there. Please be careful of dropping papers, cigarette butts, and things of that nature. When we get to the second house, the traffic is going to be a very difficult problem for us to deal with. Peter here is going to follow me, and he will try to assist you in parking so that you can make an easy exit, and we can get to the third site, which will be quite a simple site. Now, I'm not going to ramble on and give any more secrets away, but in the course of presenting the three-room house to you, I have a storyboard with flip-over charts, and I'm going to show you how very early people, when they first married, how they expected to start their lives, and how they would improve their houses and then expand their houses. And if not, why not? And in this case, we've got a case of why not? He didn't ever come out of poverty. So the house exists today as it did when this very, very poor man lived there back somewhere around 1782. Yes, indeed, I can.
Stay there a minute, Bob. He wants to get a picture of the map. No, stay over that way. Now, where does the house stand?
Where does it stand?
Yeah.
I'm about to surprise you. I'm going to rub the bottle and you watch what happens. Okay, everyone's here. Now, first and foremost, before I start explaining what this is all about, I want to direct your attention directly across Route 9. What do you see there? Kind of a run-down little old house, isn't it? Probably went past that thing 40 times. Never even noticed if you did. Probably turned your nose up. I want you to notice how close the door is to the Charlton Road. Well, they call it something else nowadays, but back then that was the Charlton Road. The Clifford family came here to Brookfield right after the Revolutionary War. And they stayed here till after the Civil War. And when they came here, they built this little house, three-room house. The woodshed is actually the fourth room now, but that's not unusual. I'll spend a few minutes here and try not to keep you in the sun too long, but it's because they came here, because of the nature of the business that this gentleman was involved in, this house never improved beyond the poverty level. He just managed to eke out a living where he didn't have to rent property. But he never made enough money to improve the property that he owned, that he built. He was a shoemaker. I don't advise you to go in here, but about 20 feet in is a 12 by 12 stone foundation still standing from his shoe shop. And there are people that have lived in this town 70 years that never saw it. So if you want to scratch, it's a really wonderful thing that few people have seen. It's belonged to that house from day one. Now, as this very narrow cart road to Charlton expanded, the house didn't move, but the road did. And you notice they keep pushing the wall further and further. And if the new state statutes take place with the drainage requirements, they're going to have to take half of the three-room house. They'll be down to 1.5 rooms. This is why it's important that you know and understand what we have here, because the pressures of modern society. When Route 9 was put through here, it was put through here in 1914. Used to go over Elm Hill Road, Elm Hill Farm Road. It's now here. You needed a wider road. If this ever goes to a passing lane road or a modernized road, that house has to go, either to be moved or something else. It still sits on its original site. Now, what I'm going to do is give you just a few minutes of the history of that, and we'll try to get you into the shade somewhere. But first and foremost, I want you to look at this house. I want you to look at this house carefully. I had a chance for the first time since the 40s to go into that house and look at that house. By the strangest of coincidences, the man had just pulled all the plasterboard off half of the house he was remodeling. And I had a chance to look at the inside construction of the house. And when I get into this, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's almost like everybody followed the same blueprint. The house is pretty much as defined. Now let me show you what happened with this house. First and foremost, when the family left here in 1869, we got a flood of red Irish in here. These people came in here They came from a civilization, I hope there's no Irishmen that are offended, but they came from a civilization that were accustomed to living with their animals in the same room in some cases. They made no major effort to improve any of the properties that they lived in town. Now I'm talking about the working class, probably typical of the lower middle class New England Yankees that were here at the time. Well, the working Irish came in at about that level, but the Yankees thought they were superior to the Irish because they always had to have that level below them. So consequently, they looked down their nose at the Red Irish for a great number of years. The Irish lived in here for a great number of years and never improved it. And then in the 30s of this century, the Bridge family moved in here and they never improved it. And that's what preserved the three-room integrity of this house. Well, let me tell you a little story about this house. When a young lady and young man of any means, probably the man was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, 21, the young lady was probably in the neighborhood of 18, back in the 1800s, and that's the best time to talk about, even though this probably predates that by a small amount. They would build a small three-room house and let nature take its course, which it would, and a year or two later they'd start to fill the house. More and more children would arrive, usually one every 18 months for the better part of 20 to 25 years, if it's a typical family at that time. So you might find a family size of anywhere from 12 to 18 kids. Of course, there were many that were lost for a variety of diseases and things like that, but the families were still relatively large compared to today. Well, the kids, when they got big enough to walk, would go up in the loft, and there was a pair of stairs provided for that. And the evidence is in that house that it was there. And they would sleep on boards across the ceiling joists with nothing between them and the snow but the roof shingles and a few isolated boards. That's not so old. Our house in the Quaboag in Enfield was just like that. We used to look through the roof at night. So there's nothing strange about that at all. Many of you folks probably acquainted with that kind of living. However, in a three-room house, you had a kitchen. Now, I showed the kitchen going this way because Old Sturbridge Village had done an enormous amount of research, and I was privileged to dig with them at their archaeological school and do a lot of studying with them. So I just showed you the house, the Bixby house from South Barry that they had moved. And this is typical of that house. This house here, the kitchen ran this way. Everything else was the same. Had the huge fireplace, only a small cellar under for storage. The rest of the house had no cellar. It still doesn't. There's virtually no cellar under that house. Another interesting thing is the water. They strategically located the water in many, many cases. Now, remember, this is the eaves and this is the road. Now, let me show you what they did. This is the setting room, and usually they'd find one or two chairs. Up to 1820, it was rare that a house, middle-class America, had a chair for everybody in the family to sit in at the same time. That was rare. By 1840, when people got wealthy enough, you'd go into their best room, you'd find a row of chairs all around the wall. They're just displaying their wealth to anyone who happened to come. That was the way they did it. They slept in the best room. The bed was located in here. If you had your best company, they'd come and sit there with you beside your bed. They had one small storage area over the masonry work in this so-called sitting room, and they had a little drawer arrangement underneath the stairs that were going down into the small storage area and upstairs. You had a utility door going out to the well. Now, as time went on and people developed more and more families, you were able to improve your property. First thing you did was add a utility area and a woodshed. Little buggers are still sleeping up in the garret. You know, they can tolerate that. Put another blanket on them. You had this for a variety of chores. Remember, women were doing putting out work. They were sewing uppers for shoes. They were doing a wide variety of different things. Consequently, they were braiding straw for straw hats. They were doing a whole variety of things. This gave them a utility area, and look what they did. They moved the well indoors. Wow, think of that, all the modern luxuries, huh? And here's the woodshed. And what we found, this is a wooden floor over, we found, incidentally, this is typical, only the well is in this corner, not this corner. They were throwing their rubbish and trash underneath where before they used to throw it out the back window. That was your dump. That is typical of New England. I mean, even the upper class people threw their stuff out the window where you couldn't see it from the road. And that's where their dumps are. You can read the history of almost everybody in New England by looking out the window opposite the easiest passage to the kitchen. Look for the dump. You'll find the history of that family pretty well buried outside the window. Now, As time went on, and now you find these buildings all over New England. And this is what you now find, and you find them everywhere, without question. This has now become a 5-room or 6-room house. Gables to the road. We got a new bedroom. Wallpaper, middle class with wallpaper. Still no baseboards, but they painted them on. You actually drew a line and painted a baseboard around the house. Isn't that a marvelous idea? Hide all your mop stains. The fact remains that the new bedroom showed up, and here's an amazing thing that began to appear in the 1840s. A closet. Heretofore, they didn't have a lot of drawered furniture and what have you. Remember, we're talking about middle-class America now. You're not going into these real luxurious houses where people had bureaus and all sorts of secretaries and various other things. This is middle-class America. Not a lot of furniture. Not a lot of furniture. A lot of hooks hanging on the walls. Boy, you could hang season after season of clean, dirty, whatever clothes you wanted. But the fact remains, the closets began to appear in some small way. Even got a closet in storage in the Bixby house. So you can see the development of what happened. There was a hazard to moving the well indoors. When they did that at our house up in Enfield on Prescott Ridge Road, there was a wooden floor. And all during the winter, we were plagued with black snakes that would come out of the rocks in the well and crawl across the floor. So you see, there were major disadvantages to modern technology. Later on, we got a pump on there, and we were able to do some other things to discourage the snakes, but never completely. Now, before we've gotten warm and overheated, does anyone have any questions before I take you to the next site, and we'll spend more time there than here? No questions? Yes, sir. What is your question?
There's not a family named Rich lived there in recent years.
They're still there. Matter of fact, the old Mr. Britch has moved to a modern trailer in the back, and one of his sons has gone back in time, and he's presently living there. Sir? Oh, real? Yes. Yes, his daughter was Rachel Britch. She was a country western singer in the late 40s and the early 50s. I went to school with her, so did Nancy. Is that right? Where was the bathroom? Well, let me tell you, I showed you the well down here. When they went to putting in inside outhouses, people started to get sick because they didn't distinguish the hazard of having the bathroom close to the well. And for a long period of time there, in these modern houses, you didn't drink water because you knew water made you sick. They didn't know why. But that's one of the hazards of the bathroom. Heretofore, you'd have found an outhouse, very somewhat flimsily constructed. You know, it was sort of you avoided it in a blizzard if you could. You know, because oftentimes you'd be outside rather than inside. Okay, any other questions before we move on? I want you to look at where we're going to visit now. We're going to leave here. Here you are. We're going to go down Mill Street, turn left, cross the Quaboag River, and just after you cross the river, you'll see a large chair frame on your left-hand side. Look right behind that, and you'll see this wonderful house built in 1731. It's a small salt box built by John Watkins. Just down for a short distance further, a couple of houses down, you'll see a yellow-orange oil cedar shingle blacksmith house. It's now been made into a modern residence. That was Brigham's blacksmith shop. We're going to turn right on this road. When we turn right, there's going to be a huge hip-roof white house. That used to be a little tiny building about the size of this building expanded. That was the store. That was Hale's store right up until 1800. If you travel down that road, the first or second building on the left, you'll look up on the side and you'll see the most gorgeous early 1700s, 1734, 1735, 1737 house. It's Abbott's house. It's an English garrison roof house, gable with the road, eaves to the road. You can't miss it. It's magnificent. It still has its original fireplaces and what have you intact. They've been rebuilt, but they're still the original fireplaces. Beyond that, we'll turn left and we will go to the fortified house. Now, when we go to the fortified house, I'm going to yield the floor to Peter from the Historical Society because you're going to see the house in its setting. But the old road used to pass by that, and I'll show you where that was, and down in the valley, and you can't get there from here because of the pucker brush and what have you. But Peter Terry, earlier times, had done some work so that people could get in from the other side. There's a double stone wall. Down across the two branches of the Salmon Brook are the most magnificent stone bridges you can imagine. Slab over stone bridges with parallel stone walls built in this being the bridge looking away on both sides, parallel stone walls with rock lintels so the animals can't get off the road or can't get on the road, depending on whether you got them in the field or on the road. These are, we almost lost these a few years back. The Historic Commission went to battle with the developer. We saved a pair of bridges. This is late 18th century bridges. It's important that you see those if you can, but you'll have to strike out on that on your own another time. But Peter at the other site will tell you how to get there, and it's very simple to get there, okay? So with that, let's saddle up and go to our next site where it's probably a little cooler than this one. Did y'all get a chance to examine that nice little neighborhood I was talking to you about as we crossed over?
Yeah.
After the bridge? You mean you missed the whole neighborhood?
No, I don't. If I knew where it was, I could look at it.
I saw you drinking your lunch. Listen, for the benefit of those folks that didn't see this last week, this is a picture of what this place looked like. So I'm going to pass it around. I got to have it back. It doesn't look like that anymore, so I can't take another picture like this. Nancy, where are you? Come here. This is my carrier. She carries my hat. Walk around, show the folks that are interested. That's another red Irishman.
What is this red Irishman?
Well, it's a term that early New Englanders gave these imports from Ireland that came over to work in the shoe industries based on complexion, because a majority of them, well, I'm not saying they did this, but a majority of them had this red complexion, and at least the ones that the men associated with. So the people who lived in what's the doctor's name? We got the people living near to Dr. Ainger's house. Where are these folks at? Right there. Nancy's cousin, Dr. Fletcher, wrote a book about that house, and they talk about one of the family members wanting to marry one of these loud, obnoxious female Irish women. And I think she was drummed out of the family. They lived in that house. So that takes you back to the 1840s in New England attitudes towards not the Scotch Irish. They were dearly loved. We're talking about strictly the Irish. If they didn't go to our church, they weren't right. You know, they had a problem. Understand that. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this house, and then I'm going to tell you how it grew. First, why it was here. I had you look at the little hamlet as we crossed. And except for this lady that drank her lunch, everybody saw the little hamlet. Well, the first French and Indian Wars began in 1688. This is when the Jesuits from the north picked up the English-France war in England and in Europe and brought it to America. The French soldiers often came with the Indians. There were 30-odd tribes associated with the Frenchmen to the north, allies, if you will, who came down and did their bidding. They did it as frankly, it was sort of an economic program for them, because they brought back captives which they sold, which they kept to replace lost children. Artifacts that they took, they brought back. It had worth, it had value. There was ransom value for the prisoners. There was lots of reasons why they should come this far south to make war on Englishmen. And they took in the course of the 74 years of war 1,500 Englishmen out of central Massachusetts and some of the eastern towns north. Just a handful of them were ever ransomed and brought back. But the community recognized in this very primitive frontier the need to defend oneself. Remember, this is the frontier. 30 miles in this direction is Marlborough, the closest town. 28.5 miles in this direction is Springfield, the next closest town. There is no help. These people are alone. Remember what I said before? It's the most segregated, most separated, most distanced English settlement in North America by the period of time we're talking about. This is the second settlement we're talking, because the town was destroyed in 1675. Well, in 1698, Walker came here, and he began to build a building, but he recognized the need because these buildings were springing up in different places. As each little hamlet in all of this town of Brookfield, there were 65 square miles, 7 towns. Ware, a large section of Ware, New Braintree, and the 4 Brookfields were represented in this huge town. Little hamlets, depending on the quality of the land in different areas, sprung up in different places. Those people needed a place to retreat to after 1688, when the French began to make war upon us. They came up with this system of fortified houses, and that stayed in effect really until 1760, when a string of forts came down through New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Matter of fact, we had one of the forts on Coy Hill. It was called the Old French Fort. However, we're talking about a period of time that precedes that by some 60-odd years. They built a series of fortified houses, and we had many of them in Brookfield. We had a total of 6. Over in West Brookfield, where McIntyre Chevrolet is, there was a fortified house sitting there. That was Mark's fortified house, and that was built to defend the people who farmed in that general area. There was a strong house where people had accumulated ordnance. They had powder, they had food, they had containers of water. A variety of different other necessities of life were accumulated in these buildings. We had 6 of them. People could retreat to them. It worked. Sometimes. In Lancaster, in 1676, the Indians destroyed the fortified house of the Reverend Rowlandson. A total of 40 people died in that town, and equal number went captive north. We play a very close part in that attack because the chief who destroyed Brookfield 6 months earlier, Meetomp, also destroyed that town. Incidentally, they hung him in Boston. Seward's diary tells us they hung him in Boston along with his father. I suppose that took care of his father for what he perpetrated on us Englishmen. But at any rate, the second house was Goss's. Well said, Marcus, well said. Mr. Goss had a fortified house. Mr. Goss's fortified house was about 1.5 miles from McIntyre Chevrolet, up on the old road. I'm not sure what they call that old road now. It's called the Hadley Path Road or not, but there's a beautiful big farm. It used to be a horse farm. Anyone know the name of that? Cutler Road? Yeah. You know the name of that huge, beautiful farm that's there with the white fences and what have you?
Sawmill, something.
Okay, that was the site of Goss's fortified house, and that was for that hamlet heading from there down to the river area. Gilbert had one. Gilbert had one. It probably was a little earlier than this one. Gilbert's was down not where the marker is. Gilbert's was down where the town very successfully bulldozed and put in a playing field, a playground, right over the site of Gilbert's fort. Artifacts galore have come out of there in past history. They didn't recognize that that was such a precious spot, and so consequently the Historic Commission didn't respond, not knowing. That might have been my fault or someone else's, but we didn't know that. I walked over the hill one day and saw the bulldozers. The damage was done. Jennings had the next fortified house, and that was up on Foster Hill. You know where you all stop for your lunch? Just down beyond that, heading east. There's a road to the left, the Allen Road, George Allen Road, the next corner. Joseph Jennings had a garrison there. Last year, if you were on the tour, I talked about that fortified house hearing gunfire at the Bannister fortified house up near Elm Hill Farm, and how the 6 men went there and the trouble they got into. That was the fortified house. That was Jennings. Bannister had a fortified house, and that was on the way to Elm Hill Farm. Tradition has it right down here by this other hamlet. And they missed the mark by almost 100 years. The Bannisters lived in Podunk. They moved out of the fortified house area and over into Podunk, where they lived for many, many years until finally one of the Bannisters settled on the common up near the library in Brookfield. That was Steph. And then Walker. We have Mr. Walker. We finally got to Mr. Walker's house. Samuel Walker came here to Brookfield, got his grant of land. In 1698, he started to build a house. 4 years later, in 1702, he gave it to his son and went on with another building. This is the old road. Can you see the wood fence over there? There's an old road. We came up part of it. The old road went right past the fortified house, and it winds itself down around the corner, and it ends up coming back onto the road that we initially came. But between here and there on the other road was this impassable swamp, Salmon Brook Swamp. In the 1830s and 40s, they put a corduroy road and later made an improved road there, so now you can drive right across it, and this road fell out of repair before the Civil War. And you can't go down this road to the wonderful artifacts that I was describing to you because of the pucker brush. But later, before we leave here, Peter Terry, wherever you are, Peter's going to give you a description of how to find that place. And if you can walk and you have a camera, don't miss it. It was almost destroyed a few years ago, and the Historic Commission finally interceded with the developer and saved the bridges. But boy, it was just, by gosh and by golly, it was a real close call. Now, 1698 they came here, and I want you to picture, remember we said a 3-room house because of the economies at the time? We didn't have a sawmill in Brookfield that was operating. One started and was incorporated by 10 men in 1708, but it wasn't making sawdust till 1710. Okay, and that was up on Malt Bridge Road, up in New Braintree. So, in the meantime, Walker came to our hill. See the chimney here? This would be an outside wall. He built this half of the house. 2-story. It was called a half house. A 2-story. He didn't have the resources to continue. It was a 3-bay house. And he built the house. Forget the shed on the back. That wasn't there. Okay, later years, and the Sills will tell you the story if you examine them closely. Later years, they came up and they added another bay, and they finally added a 6th bay. Sometime in the 18th century, the early 18th century, this house began to expand. The wealth of the Walkers is well known. They became very, very wealthy farmers here, so they could afford to do this. Sometime in the early 18th century, they then added that wonderful shed on the back that gives you the typical salt box appearance. And if you look at the side of the building when you get done here, you'll notice the joint, and you can see where that's been added to this building. Okay, I don't know if some of you can see it now, though. One thing that's wrong with what we're looking at, there's something here that doesn't belong on houses of this period or any period up until 1800. Does anybody know what's wrong at what you're looking at? Everything is beautifully and historically done except the roof. The what? Something else. It's probably even more important than that. No. There's paint on the building. Who would waste their money painting a building even then? They didn't paint buildings. Historically, you will find study after study after study that shows once people began to paint the churches. Jack Larkin's book tells you they painted them bright pumpkin. Some of them were a lavender color with gray trim. I mean, they wanted these churches to stand. And with the Irish invasion, they had to stand out, you know? They began to paint. And then slowly, commons developed. People developed their businesses, craftsmen developed around, and commons began to develop in 1800. And then you begin to see people building around this center common, and that's where our New England common came from. Brookfield came late. We didn't get our common until about 1840, 1850. But early towns like West Warren and West Brookfield and other towns began to develop commons early 1800s. That's when the people living in the country wanted to be like the big bugs uptown. And you began to see housewives pressuring their husbands, you know, get a little oil this week, and we'll get a little bit of iron oxide next week, and a little turpentine, we'll mix it together and throw the kids on a ladder. They began to paint their houses. And strangely enough, that was the 18 to 1820 was called the whitening of America, because then the people around the common began to say, white looks nice. Then the church got the idea, hey, that's better than pumpkin, isn't it? So then people out in the country began to paint, and white was the predominant color. Sad part about that is how they made the paint. You know, it was lead paint, right? Descriptions. There was a study done in France in 1800 of the effects of lead on people and how they made paint, lead paint, white lead paint. They took these huge sheets of lead and they hung them over these cauldrons of boiling vinegar. And the acid interacted with the face of the lead, and these men would come up with their bare hands and scrape off this froth. And that white froth was then mixed. And 30 days after, the men turned up with black gums. That was the beginning. And they all had very useful lives, even though short as they may be, because people were buying a lot of paint. But they didn't recognize, even with this French study, and because the French did it, we weren't interested anyway. We still don't like them. The fact is that we ignored their study and continued business as usual until fairly recent history when we began to recognize the effects of lead on the human beings. Now, I explained to you the expansion and everything that happened here. Does anyone have any questions about this? This is a precious artifact. This house, part of this house, remember you're talking 1698, part of this building. He started his home here. Now think about this. Think about this, the spread of time. We're talking almost 300 years. Where else in this country, with few exceptions, can you go and share this? Can you see why I get all cranked up? Isn't this wonderful? And 100 years from now, some kid's going to look at that and say, whoa! And he's going to come in, it's going to be a cellar hole. probably. Yes. So anyway, this is why this is so important that we share these assets with as many folks. And you notice some young folks here, and there's even some middle-aged folks and a few younger ones, huh? Yes, he makes all our tours. He's our future president. Anyone else have any questions they'd like? Yes, sir. Yes, sir, there is. At one time it was partial, and as they expanded, they dug it out and then built the cellar hole. But you can see the joinery in the beams, in the sills, where they expanded. And that's why we know that they did it 3 times. They went from a 3 or half house to a 5 bay, and then finally to a 6 bay, and that's what you're seeing today. Bay is the section, if you were to have it, you could make a room.
This land would all be cleared at that time, right?
This land, by 1800, this land here you could see in every direction for 3 or 4 miles, because people were burning wood, and people who lived on farms sold their kids labor cutting wood. And an average house like this house would probably use about 30, 40 cords of wood a year. A small 3-room like we looked at earlier would probably use 15 cords, and a 5-room is using 20 to 25 cords of wood a year. So you see, that's an enormous amount of wood that had to be gathered. In addition to that, we had ironworks and great amounts of charcoal were being made, and to run an ironworks, it was taking several square miles of hardwoods per year. So you see, it didn't take long to draw down our wood supply.
Now, what kind of a farm would you be running up there?
This kind of a farm is typical New England farm. He would have neat cattle, that's bovines. He would have the various assortment, not so many goats, but you'd find sheep. They don't talk about rabbits, I suppose, because they run wild here, but a lot of poultry, some ducks, but primarily a small farm, and he would depend on selling labor for the majority of his income, except for the wood and the other assets.
How much would it take 30 cords a winter if you used an airtight stove and today's modern insulation? How much would it take to heat?
If you used the modern, well, if you would probably heat a house like this in 6 cords of wood a year. It depends on the family's habits, okay? But you have to remember, if you think of the fireplace that I drew, in the entire period that we're talking about, up to and including the 3-room house, on a winter night, everything liquid in that house except alcohol froze every winter night. Remember that, because you had a negative heat situation. You had a fireplace without benefit of a damper or a smoke chamber, and as the column of hot air went up, it created a negative or vacuum in the house, and every opening in the house drew in the outside air. The house would have stayed warmer if you didn't burn the fireplace. Really, truly, for the course of a few hours. The only place warm was in front of the fireplace, so you can see why the habits in New England, people didn't bathe usually from December to April.
What do they use for a foundation in here? It seems even with the addition that there is no uneven settlement.
No, it's fieldstone. It's fieldstone, and a fieldstone wall laid properly below the frost, if it follows the geometric or the map that was established during the period, that will stay for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years with no disturbance.
No cement or anything.
No. And it's because of that even though the frost works on the walls will float slightly, but they will, if the wall is well built, they will. If it's chinked properly, it won't go anywhere. It won't move.
How is this house laid out? Is the kitchen in the back?
I don't know how they presently... Does anyone know how they... The kitchen is now in the back? Okay, that's Peter Terry, in case anybody... He's answering all the questions I can't.
This used to be the living room, and the other 2 rooms are bedrooms. I don't know what was upstairs, but the kitchen was in the back.
Thank you, Pete.
Was the house ever attacked?
No. This house was never attacked. It never came under siege. And the reason it didn't come under siege was we were south of the river. Now, many of the houses on the other side didn't, because Indians are strange characters. They knew there was 6 men at Fort Gilbert back in 1693, and it still took them 3 days to decide to attack the 5 helpless families over there. You know, so they had to have overwhelming odds, and if they came here and attacked, they had to pass through a hamlet, they had to get across the river. Boats aren't available. Boats weren't available, so what, you know, this was a no-win situation for them. If they couldn't at least see a major advantage up front. They didn't even bother to do it. I mean, what's the point? They can go somewhere else. By the time that this was fully developed, 1710, the last Englishman was killed in Brookfield, down along the river. After that, even though the wars went on until 1763, they never came back to Brookfield because Brookfield was beginning to build a population. More importantly, satellite towns were beginning to develop. Belchertown was developing, Hardwick was developing, Sturbridge was developing. We were getting satellite towns. All of a sudden, there was this core of towns, and these same individuals had to make their way through those communities to escape. Oh, no way. The odds were not in their favor, so consequently, Brookfield did not come under attack again. Many other communities did. Pardon? There were here or the ones attacking? There were 30 different Indian tribes, and they were spread between the Iroquois and, surprising enough, the Iroquois and primarily they were Algonquin type of tribes, the Ottawas in the north and what have you. The Hurons, who later professed to be Algonquins, were not. They were actually Iroquois Indians, got mad at the Iroquois and went north, said, "The hell with you guys, you know, we're on our own." And they did, because some elements of the Iroquois were cannibals. Oh yeah, they did, and many of the Indians to the north were indeed cannibals. And often you read in the stories of Ticonderoga with a Frenchman which throw them a young Englishman, and they'd throw them in their cook pot down in Frenchtown so they'd leave the rest of the captives alone. So you have to understand, but this was, remember, this was their psyche. Don't criticize them for it. There's lots of people in the world that did that right up into just a few years ago in different parts of the earth today. All right, so this was what they had learned and what they had lived with all of their lives. Now, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Bob, you say this was a fortified house.
Yes, it was.
How would they fortify it? Would they be shutters on the inside?
Not necessary. Not necessary, because the people in there had firearms. So that meant that anybody here, and you know, the Indians were darn good shots because they had little else to do. And the Dutch and the French made sure they had enough ordnance, so they got really good at what they did. Now, you look at a building like this, and it's hard to say because it varies. But usually from the floor to this point here, within the wall, they would, if they had a brick facilities, they would put brick, they would put fieldstone, they would put timbers, they would add mass to the wall so that if you didn't stand up, you were safe. If you stood up, like I told them last week, you're on your own. But as long as you were down below that barrier, the probability of this huge diameter shot penetrating that much mass and getting to the inhabitants was relatively small. In Lancaster, they fired hundreds and hundreds of shots and only hit one or two people inside the building. Same at Brookfield, but they didn't even have the benefit of this when the fortified house, so-called Ayers Tavern, was destroyed. Just people stayed low. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
From whom would I acquire, and how much acreage would I get for a lot in 1680, 70, 90, whenever when they built?
Well, you could get it several ways. Several ways. One, first and foremost, there is a committee in Brookfield that's empowered to make grants. Okay. Now the initial shipment, the initial settlement, John Pynchon was the Sears and Roebuck. He bought the whole thing from the Indians, and then he turned and sold it to you at a 30% profit. So he made big bucks, and yet it was the cheapest place in New England to buy land. You could buy a farm for 20 pounds and have it paid off in a year. You couldn't do that anywhere else. So it was enticement to bring people here. By the period of time we're talking about, they were still giving grants. You could come to town and you could ask for a grant. They would look at your value, your worth, your family status, your religion, are you a free man or not, and then they would... No, forget Pynchon now. He's gone down the tube. He died in 1704, 17... Anyway, this is a brand new regime now. We've got a new settlement starting, and we have a committee. They're deciding. When you get the grant, you may or may not have to pay for it, depending on your worth. Okay? The odds are you won't have to pay for it, because most people came here were middle-class people. Mr. Walker probably had to pay, but there's no records that he did, so he probably had influence. Then the other way was to come and see a piece of land and buy it from the guy that was living there. You could still do that then. The deeds still exist. Another thing, from the first settlement, if you could run into any of the people who lost their families at that settlement and had inherited that, or had lived here and left and didn't come back. They could sell you their property, and much of that property was sold. As a matter of fact, the next site we visit, this guy bought several pieces of property from the first settlement settlers. Okay, and I'll get into that later. Did I answer your question?
Bob, could you tell me how long a period between the evacuation of the first settlement and the beginnings of a new settlement?
The first settlement began right where we were having our lunch. It's probably the site where John Warner built the first house on the frontier in 1660. In August 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of 1675, the Indians descended. They defeated the English army for the first time in North America, up in Menominee and New Braintree. The English broke and ran, and the Indians went wild. We can beat them, they figured. We can beat them for the first time. So the end result was the siege of the fortified house in August of 1675. They destroyed the town. The town stayed nearly vacant. The militia were here, but the town stayed nearly vacant until 1686, when a militia soldier by the name of Ford petitioned the general court to reestablish and reincorporate Brookfield. They didn't let him. He later came here and got a grant, but they didn't let him. But they appointed a committee, and people began to get grants. They couldn't get grants where the old settlement was. They began to get grants in the surrounding areas, and this is what separated the populations. There, the need for the fortified houses come 1689, when the French and Indian predators came down from the north. Any other questions you might have?
We're in a wooden building,
Yeah.
fortified, but what about if the Indians shot arrows or fire?
Well, I think the best example of that is what they did to the fortified house in Brookfield. It probably had a grass, or a thatched roof, if you will. They talk about cutting through the roof and pouring their drinking water on the flames. Okay? So, and these guys weren't as handy as you think they were. You know, they couldn't make fire as easily as you think they, sometimes they were pretty darn inept at what they did. So the end result was they weren't able to burn that building, and yet, once the siege was raised, down on, and you'll see it next year if you come on our 4-hour all-day tour of the original plantation. I'll tell you what they did down there. There was a group selected who did nothing but make fire arrows by the hundreds. They had plans, so if the militia had not come from Lancaster and relieved the siege, that house probably would have fallen, and we wouldn't have known most of what had happened there, because we wouldn't have had Captain Wheeler's notation on his surprise and everything that's happened elsewise. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
Yes, you said that this, what we call a salt bar.
The shed, yes.
Added later?
Yes, but early. Yeah, you can see the joint up in the ceiling, up in the trim. You can see where they added it. And these people are very careful to reconstruct everything pretty much like it was. Can you see the joint on the trim board running down the... You have to step back and you can see it. It'll look like a regular 2-story house, and then you look carefully and you can see where the shed was added in the trim boards. Any other questions you might have? Okay, well, we're going to saddle up now. We're going to go back, and for the lady that drinks, keep your eye open. Pardon?
Wasn't Peter going to tell us something?
Oh, yes. Wait. Look at the big note. Don't forget Peter Terry's comments. Peter, come on. This is Peter Terry. Now, remember I mentioned these beautiful twin stone bridges over the forks of the salmon with the lintels and all the things? These are unique. You probably have not seen the likes of this anywhere, and you may not see it again. He's going to tell you the only way that I know that you can successfully get in there. So, Peter? Wait a minute, Pete. Wait a minute, Peter.
Austerity here.
This is Peter Terry from the Quaboag Brookfield Historical Commission. And that lady's ear is right in the lens.
When you leave here, you'll go down the hill and you'll come to Long Hill Road, which leads back to 148. When you get on the hill and you come to Long Hill Road, take a left and go up here 7/10 of a mile. It's just before the Quaboag Wildlife Management Area. And there'll be a little dead-end street with some new houses on the left. And just before that, there's two white 4x4s. They're about this tall, still sticking out of the ground. There's a sign there, but it's on the ground. Someone stole it, and then they brought it back. But if you go down to the left of that sign, you walk in the woods. It's pretty brushy in there now. They cut it out originally about 5 or 6 years ago, but the blackberry briars and stuff has grown in now. But there's 2 stone walls. There's one on each side, and you have to walk down there, probably close to a 1/4 of a mile, and you come to the first bridge. and then you'll come into some hemlocks and pines, and you can still see the walls, and then you keep walking and you'll come to the other bridge. There's 2 small brooks that they cross down there, and then the road used to come back up into here.
Thank you, Peter. Actually, what he's telling you is that the twin stone walls identify where the road is. That's the old road. Remember, I went by here. If when you come in from that direction, if you stay to the uphill side of the further stone wall and walk along that stone wall, you'll be out of a lot of the blackberries, and you can walk through the woods, keeping your eye on the stone wall, and you'll come down to the marsh. And once you get into the marsh, step back onto the road, you'll be between the stone walls, and you should be able to get in there with a minimum of effort, and it's worth seeing. I recommend you bring your camera, bring your kids. It's the most wonderful sight you're going to find.
It's all right just to walk in?
Yes.
There's
There's quite a bit more literature on this house. This is not all. If you stop at the library in Brookfield, they have the Historical Commission right up on this house has additional information that supports a lot of what I said, and but not all of it, but it supports what I said. It has additional information on it. Okay, am I on, sir? Okay, we have everyone here. I didn't drag you all the way out here to look at this 1840 style house. Mr. Sawyer lives here, and he's quite an elderly man, and he likes it the way it is, so that's all right. That's all right. He's not presently living here, but he said, we can come here, but we're not to enter the building, so we won't. But you'll notice all these wonderful Model A's and his old Plymouths and everything all through the fields back when he was farming and making his own tractor, so it's almost like going back in time a little bit. The importance of this place is the site. The site is important because several things happened here. First and foremost, the first representative to the General Court lived here from Brookfield, from Greater Brookfield. He went to the General Court in 1717 and represented the people who lived in at that time, the 7 towns that made up Brookfield. That was important to us. He did that for a great number of years, but I think his story and the story of his missus is probably a lot more important than any service he might have provided as a representative. Remember, we were talking about the French and Indian Wars, and at the onset of the first French and Indian War in 1689, the Indians descended on a small town of Dover, New Hampshire, and they attacked the fortified house. Remember the fortified house? They attacked a fortified house belonging to a family by the name of Otis. They caught them unaware. The people had not gathered at the fortified house, and what they did, they killed Mr. Otis and they killed a small child, but the Indians captured a 3-month-old baby, Margaret, and her mother, and took them north to Canada. The story ends there temporarily. In 1704, during the beginning of the Queen Anne War, this is the second Indian War. We went through Williams, and then we went through Queen Anne, and then we went through the old French and Indian, and then the new French and Indian Wars. 74 years of this stuff. Well, anyway, now it's 1704, and the Indians descend on Deerfield. Deerfield up along the Connecticut River in Massachusetts here, and they killed 40 people. They're still buried in a common grave. You can go up to the cemetery and see the big bump in the ground. 40 people are resting there. They took 125 captives onto Canada with them. Many died along the way. One of the captives was a young officer in the militia. His name was Thomas Baker. He was 21 years old. And they took him north. Well, he was there for a while, and he escaped, which was virtually unheard of, because people who escaped from Canada usually did it in the winter and never came out this end of the funnel. They were lost somewhere between where they ran away and here. So very rarely did anyone ever get here. Thomas Baker didn't get here. He got captured, and the Indians were going to kill him. He got away again, and he ran to a Frenchman's house, and he begged, and the Frenchman bought him from the Indians. Later, he was ransomed and sent back to Massachusetts. And he went on. He served in the militia for a number of years. At any rate, this young Christina was taken up in Dover. She was 3 months when they took her. She grew to young womanhood. She was a teenage girl, raised by the Ursuline nuns, raised as a Catholic, married to a Frenchman. His name was Lebeau, a Frenchman by the name of Lebeau, and she had 3 children by this man. And he died young. He died very young, leaving her a widow with 3 children. Well, the governor of Massachusetts sent Lieutenant Baker north to negotiate a ransom to free some of the captives that were there. And he spied this young widow woman. Whoa. I mean, here's an unmarried bachelor up there, and he sees this gorgeous young woman who can't speak a word of English. Remember, 3 months on, she was raised as a Frenchman. But language doesn't limit people when they fall in love. It's just one of those things, and they did. He helped her to get onto a ship. Then he arranged ransom. She appealed to the French. Let me bring my 3 children back to New England. No. You can go if they pay the ransom. They can't buy your children. They must stay in Canada, and stay they did. Well, she came back. She came back to New England, to Northampton. The General Court recognized she was here, and as they did to so many other captives, they said, well, if you agree to stay in this province and further agree to marry Captain Baker, we will give you a grant of land. And she agreed, and they gave her 60 acres here in Brookfield. Now, this is not the 60 acres. This was part of Thomas Baker's 60 acres. His acres ran from here towards Elm Hill Farm Road, where we did the tour last year. Christine started on what was a small side road, Buxton Hill Road, that I had marked last year on the tour, and came up and made Captain Baker's land. By the time Baker left Brookfield, he had over 1,000 acres that he had acquired. But then he lost all that. And I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. But at any rate, so she was told if she tarried in this province and married Baker, that she would get the grant of land. Well, she tarried and she married. And they came here and they built their home. And they had several children. Well, when she went north, her mother was taken prisoner at the same time. And her mother ended up marrying a Frenchman and had a son. Well, that became this girl's brother-in-law. He came here to Brookfield and worked here. He spent a summer here. And he told her that there was a chance, if she went to Canada and she begged enough, the Jesuits or the Ursulines would permit her at least to see her children. So she did. She went all the way to Canada, and she begged them. And the end result was they forbid her to see her children, and she did not see her children ever again. They said, if you come back here and we forgive you your ways, she had converted to being a Congregationalist. And if you become a Catholic once again and join our ranks, then yes, you may have your children. She wouldn't do that. She wanted to come back to New England. The end result was she never did see those children to the day she died. They know not who she is to this day, or their descendants. The thing that happens now that makes it even sadder was that after she got back here, some 15 years, just about the time she's going to leave Brookfield, she got a letter from the Jesuits saying, come north, we will negotiate with you, we want you to come and stay here, we'll arrange for you to meet your children if you do. The governor of Massachusetts, his name escapes me, I got to look here to try to find out what his name was. Well, I'm sure none of you care anyway, but the governor of Massachusetts wrote her and said, I implore that you don't go. Mrs. Mean's house is on Elm Hill Farm Road. Got all of that property at over 1,000 acres running all the way up to Foster Hill. He got a large chunk of the original plantation land he bought from the Millett family, Millett heirs. The Governor Burdett was the governor's name. I know somebody was going to find that important, I'm sure. But Governor Burdett was the governor who tried so desperately to get her to stay here and not play into what they had going. Well, we'll go on from here. Baker's health began to fail badly because, remember, he was quite a bit older than her. He was 21 in 1704, and in 1689 she was only 3 months. So you can see he was quite a bit older than she was. His health began to fail badly. He took in a partner, and the partner took all of his 1,000 acres and used it as collateral in some of his business deals and lost it all. So they went bankrupt. Now it's kind of a sad endorsement on our society, because here was this man of such stature that was our representative that left town. He had no visible means of support. This is a point in time, remember, as far as welfare is concerned, poor people were sold to the lowest bidder in town. The lowest bidder in town, for the smallest amount of money, agreed to keep you 1 year and get as much work as they could out of you for that year. That was our welfare system in Massachusetts until 4 farms developed in the 19th century. Well, they weren't going to go through that, so they moved on to Mendon. And when she got to Mendon, she appealed to the town fathers to let her have a license to start an inn so she could support her family. And they said no. Now, the odd thing was, if her husband had run an inn, she could have automatically had the license and continued it. But she was a lady alone. She had her husband. She had to support him. No inn. She went to court. She sued for the right to have an inn. The court said, no, you cannot. And the general court and the governor jumped into it and said, yes, she can. And they granted her a license. She ran that inn up until the point when he died. He died in 1773. Now, I think what's so different about this story is, in a point in our history where women's value was recognized, there's very little question of that, but where they never got really what was coming to them as far as publicity, notoriety, and recognition. You rarely read about women's accomplishments. Rarely. If someone died, it was the wife of so-and-so died and left so many kids, and that was it. It was the wife of so-and-so. She lost her identity even. Not so with this lady. This lady here had made such an impression, and the sacrifices she made giving up her family to return and be an Englishman where so many other Englishmen chose not to. They came here, looked around and said, I don't like it, and went north. They went right back up where they came from. They would rather be young boys, 14 years old, forgot to speak English in a matter of 7 years, came back, didn't like it, and went back to Canada. The Wolcott boys didn't want no part of us. They preferred being French. Well, I'm going to close this tour of ours before, and maybe a question or two if you have it. I wanted you to come to this site because these were important people. They were typical of what happened to 1,500 New England families during this long siege that really was nothing more than the religious wars in Europe that had washed over into New England. Her obituary, and this is the significant part of it all. I've got to put on my glasses to read the obituary. And I wrote it down, so I'll quote it verbatim. She died February 23rd, 1773, at the age of 84 years old. Her obituary. She closed her eventful life, leaving a large posterity in good reputation, being a pattern of industry, prudence, and economy. She bore a tedious illness with much patience and met her death with great calmness. What an endorsement for a point in time where women were not recognized for anything other than being so-and-so's wife. This is remarkable. I have not run into the likes of this anywhere else. So I wanted to share that with you. I wanted to share the spot where they lived and share this neat little story with you. Okay, it's not like looking at buildings, but it is worthwhile. Now, does anyone have any questions for me? Except you're tired and you want to go home and have a cup of tea. Any other questions before we break up?